My wife spent 3 months choosing the perfect dress for our son's wedding. One second, she was smiling beside me beneath the garden lights. The next, she was face down in the mud while guests stared in silence. My daughter-in-law laughed loudly. But the worst part? My own son saw everything and turned his back on his mother like she meant nothing. That was the moment I realized they didn't see us as family anymore. Just money. Just assets. So I made one decision that destroyed everything they thought they owned. And what happened next, no one saw coming. The rain had stopped only minutes earlier, but the garden still carried the smell of wet earth and crushed roses. White lights hung above the guests, glowing softly against the dark sky. Cameras flashed from every direction while the photographer hurried everyone into position for the final family portrait. Evelyn stood beside me, carefully lifting the edge of her white silk dress so it wouldn't touch the mud beneath the grass. She smiled at Michael. A small, proud smile. The kind only a mother has on her son's wedding day. "Mom, move a little closer," Tiffany said, adjusting her bouquet without even looking at her. Evelyn nodded quickly. Then it happened. A sharp pull. The violent sound of fabric tearing through the air. Evelyn gasped as the back hem of her dress jerked hard beneath someone's heel. Her body twisted sideways. One hand reached for balance, but the wet ground gave way instantly. She crashed straight into the puddle. Mud exploded across the white silk in slow motion. Cold brown water soaked through the dress within seconds. The cameras kept flashing. Click, click, click. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Tiffany laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not shock. Real laughter. "Oh my God," she said loudly, covering her mouth while grinning. "Seriously? On my wedding day?" A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Someone whispered that the grass was slippery after the rain. No one bent down to help Evelyn. I stared at my wife kneeling in the mud, her trembling fingers pressing into the soaked ground while strands of wet hair clung to her face. The dress she had spent months choosing was torn open near the waist. Then I looked at Michael. My son stood only a few feet away. He saw everything. Every second. But instead of helping his mother, he adjusted the cuff of his suit and turned toward the photographer as if nothing had happened. That was the moment something inside me went cold. How could a son watch his own mother be humiliated like that? I stepped forward and pulled Evelyn to her feet while Tiffany rolled her eyes impatiently. "Can we please keep going?" she muttered. "People are waiting." The music started again. The guests pretended nothing had happened. But later that night, what I heard behind a half-open door destroyed far more than a wedding. If you've ever sat in silence while your own family treated you like you no longer mattered, then you already understand the kind of pain that doesn't fade quickly. Tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place? Would you stay quiet to keep the family together, or walk away before they destroy what's left of your dignity? And if your own son stood there watching his mother humiliated without saying a word, could you ever forgive him? Subscribe now, because what happened after that wedding only became darker, colder, and far more cruel than anyone expected. When we walked back into the reception hall, the music was loud enough to bury what had happened outside. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of guests. Servers carried silver trays between tables covered in white roses and expensive champagne. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Tiffany stood at the center of it all like a director controlling a stage. Every detail moved around her voice. The lighting, the seating, the timing of the speeches. Even the photographers followed her hand signals before they followed the wedding planner's instructions. Meanwhile, Evelyn quietly changed into a simpler dress in the restroom because the original one was beyond saving. When she returned, she still tried to smile. That hurt me more than the fall itself. She kept smoothing the fabric near her waist, almost embarrassed for ruining the atmosphere, even though none of this had been her fault. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. Evelyn nodded too quickly. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Let's just get through tonight." But the room already felt different. An usher led us to our table near the kitchen entrance. Small, half hidden behind a decorative column. The white tablecloth was wrinkled at one corner, and every few minutes the swinging kitchen door burst open behind us with noise and heat from the staff inside. I looked toward the center of the ballroom. Tiffany's family sat near the stage beneath the brightest lights, laughing loudly while waiters filled their glasses before they even asked. Richard Morgan lifted his wine glass and grinned at another guest. "This wedding turned out exactly the way Tiffany wanted," he said proudly. A woman beside him laughed. "Well, older people usually slow things down." Another voice answered casually, especially after rain. "They need to be more careful." A few people chuckled. Not one person looked at Evelyn. Not one. She lowered her eyes to the plate in front of her and folded her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned pale. At that moment, I began noticing things I had ignored before. The way Tiffany interrupted Evelyn whenever she spoke. The way Michael instantly sided with Tiffany over the smallest decisions. The way her family acted as though we were guests invited out of obligation rather than parents who had sacrificed everything for their son. And somewhere between the loud laughter at the head table and the silence at ours, a question kept circling inside my head. When did parents become outsiders at their own child's wedding? I stood up a few minutes later and told Evelyn I was going to get some air. The truth was, I needed distance before I said something I couldn't take back. But as I walked past the private hallway behind the ballroom, I heard someone mention my life insurance policy. I stopped walking the second I heard my name. The hallway behind the ballroom was dimly lit, separated from the reception by a half-closed wooden door. Warm laughter and music still leaked through from the party, but back there, the atmosphere felt different. Quieter. Sharper. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. At least, not at first. But then Tiffany laughed softly and said, "Once everything is transferred, things will finally become easier for Michael." My hand tightened around the edge of the door frame. Inside the room, glasses clinked lightly. Richard Morgan spoke next, calm and confident, like a businessman discussing paperwork instead of another person's life. "Well, Robert's insurance alone is worth almost $2 million, he said. "And honestly, it makes no sense leaving all those assets unmanaged at his age." Someone chuckled quietly. Then Tiffany added, "Exactly. They're too emotional with money. Michael needs control before something goes wrong." For a moment, I couldn't breathe properly. I kept staring through the narrow opening in the door. Light spilled across the floor in thin golden lines while shadows moved inside the room. And then I heard my son's voice. "Michael." Lower than usual. Careful. But not resistant. "He's been forgetting things lately," he said. "Honestly, sometimes he gets confused about paperwork himself." Richard laughed under his breath. "That actually helps us." A few more quiet laughs followed. Something cold moved through my chest. I stood completely still, fingers digging harder into the wooden frame until my knuckles hurt. My own son. The boy I carried on my shoulders when he was too small to cross the street alone. The same child Evelyn stayed awake with during endless nights when he was sick. Now sitting in a private room discussing my death like a future business opportunity. Tiffany's voice cut through the silence again. If Robert signs the management transfer early, we can restructure everything before retirement taxes become a problem. And the house? Someone asked. Michael answered this time. We'll handle it gradually. Dad trusts me. Trusts me. The words hit harder than the laughter earlier in the garden. Because he was right. I did trust him. Or at least, I thought I did. Another short burst of laughter came from inside the room. Meanwhile, I stood outside like a stranger listening to people plan the final stage of my life without me. A terrible question slowly formed in my mind. Did my son actually love me, or was he simply waiting for me to die? I don't remember walking back to the reception hall after that. I only remember seeing Evelyn sitting alone at the small table near the kitchen, pretending to be okay for my sake. And suddenly, the entire wedding looked different. Not like a celebration. Like a transaction. That night, after we finally returned home and Evelyn fell asleep beside me, I walked quietly into my office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled out folders I hadn't touched in years. Old property records. Trust agreements. Inheritance documents. Because somewhere between Tiffany's laughter and Michael's silence, something inside me had already changed forever. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had changed. I made coffee for Evelyn, asked if she slept well, listened while she tried to defend Michael without fully defending him. He was probably overwhelmed, she whispered carefully. Weddings are stressful. I nodded once. But inside me, something had already gone quiet in a way I had never felt before. Not anger. Not grief. Clarity. And clarity can be far more dangerous. I never called Michael after the wedding. Not once. I didn't ask about the honeymoon. I didn't mention the garden. I didn't confront him about the conversation behind that door. Days passed, and the silence between us slowly became its own answer. On the third morning, I sat alone in my office with a stack of property documents spread across the desk. At the very top sat the purchase agreement for the Boston apartment. $300,000. A gift I had planned for Michael and Tiffany after the wedding. I stared at the final page for a long time before picking up my pen. One signature. That was all it took. The ink moved slowly across the cancellation line. A clean stroke. Permanent. I closed the folder afterward and slid it into a red file case beside my desk. The sound of it snapping shut echoed harder than I expected. At that exact moment, my phone lit up. Michael. I watched it ring until the screen went dark. Then it rang again. And again. I still didn't answer. For most of my life, I had spent every second trying to protect my son from consequences. Financial mistakes. Bad decisions. Failures he never even realized I fixed behind him. But sitting there alone in that quiet office, one question kept circling through my mind. Can a father ever truly stop saving his child? Or does love become weakness when it keeps rewarding betrayal? That afternoon, I drove downtown to meet Daniel Mercer, the attorney who had handled my business affairs for over 20 years. He looked surprised when I walked into his office carrying inheritance files. "Robert," he said slowly, removing his glasses. "This doesn't look routine." "It isn't," I answered. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed every trust agreement, property clause, and financial condition connected to Michael's future inheritance. Daniel leaned back eventually. "So you're serious about changing everything?" I looked out through the office window at the traffic below. "My son already changed everything," I said quietly. Daniel studied me for a moment before sliding several documents across the desk. "No emotional decisions," he warned. "Once this starts, there's no easy way back." I signed the first page without hesitation, because somewhere deep down, I already understood something painful. Michael wasn't becoming this person. He had already become him. I just refused to see it before. But while I was preparing quietly behind closed doors, Tiffany was only beginning to show who she really was. At first, Tiffany hid it behind politeness. Small comments. Tiny corrections. The kind people could easily dismiss if they only heard them once. But repetition changes everything, especially inside a family. A week after the wedding, Evelyn began visiting Michael and Tiffany's new apartment almost every day. Tiffany claimed she needed help organizing things before hosting guests. "Mom, could you wipe the kitchen counters again? Mom, the glasses still have fingerprints. Mom, you missed a spot near the floor." Always said sweetly. Always with that smile. But underneath it, there was something sharp. Something humiliating. The first time Evelyn came home late, I noticed the redness in her hands before she even removed her coat. "What happened?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," she answered quickly. "I just cleaned a little too much." But the next day, she went back again. And the day after that. Each visit left her quieter, more tired. One afternoon, I arrived at the apartment unexpectedly after bringing over documents Michael had requested. The front door wasn't fully closed when I stepped inside. I stopped instantly. Evelyn was on her knees in the living room, scrubbing the marble floor with a towel while Tiffany walked past her in high heels carrying a glass of wine. No, Tiffany sighed impatiently. "You're spreading the streaks around instead of cleaning them." Michael sat on the couch only a few feet away scrolling through his phone. He never looked up. Not once. I stood there frozen, watching my wife kneeling on the floor in silence while our son pretended not to see her. Tiffany finally noticed me near the doorway. "Oh," she said casually. "We're just trying to get everything perfect." Evelyn immediately pushed herself upright too quickly. "It's fine," she whispered before I could speak. I offered to help. Offered. The word sat heavily in my chest because I knew exactly why she said it. She was protecting Michael. Still. Even now. That evening during dinner, Evelyn barely touched her food. She kept defending Tiffany in small ways without realizing how broken it sounded. "She's stressed," Evelyn murmured. "Setting up a new home is difficult." I watched her hands trembling slightly around the spoon. Then I remembered something my mother once told me many years ago. A mother can survive humiliation longer than anyone else if she believes it will keep her child close. And suddenly I understood the trap Evelyn was living inside. She wasn't cleaning that apartment because Tiffany needed help. She was doing it because she was terrified of losing her son completely. The next week became worse. Tiffany started calling multiple times a day. "Mom, can you come early tomorrow? Mom, I need the closets reorganized. Mom, the bathroom still doesn't smell clean." Each request sounded smaller than the one before, but somehow more cruel. And every time, Michael remained silent. Not defending. Not objecting. Just allowing it to happen. One evening, Evelyn returned home exhausted and sat quietly near the kitchen window without turning on the lights. "I think I disappointed her again," she said softly. Something inside me hardened permanently at that moment. Because no woman should feel like a failure for being mistreated in her own son's home. That night, after Evelyn went upstairs to sleep, I opened my desk drawer slowly and took out a small recording device. Because this time, I had started documenting everything. What started as helping out for a few days slowly turned into something far uglier. At first, Tiffany framed everything like harmless family favors. "Mom, Could you organize the pantry? Mom, can you wipe down the cabinets again? Tiny requests. Easy requests. The kind that made Evelyn feel needed. But over time, the tone changed. Not openly cruel. Worse. Controlled. Calculated. One afternoon, Evelyn came home with sore knees and a forced smile that disappeared the second she thought I wasn't looking. She moved slower while setting her purse down near the kitchen table. Tough day? I asked carefully. She shook her head too quickly. No, sweetheart. Tiffany just likes things done a certain way. Certain way. That phrase began appearing more and more. The towels folded a certain way. The dishes arranged a certain way. The floors cleaned a certain way. And every time Evelyn failed to meet Tiffany's invisible standards, another quiet criticism followed. You miss dust behind the lamp. The mirrors still look cloudy. I already explained this yesterday. Always calm. Always smiling. That somehow made it worse. A few days later, I stopped by the apartment unexpectedly after Michael texted asking for old tax documents. The moment I walked inside, I heard Tiffany's voice from the living room. No, not like that. You're spreading it around. I turned the corner and froze. Evelyn was kneeling on the marble floor with a rag in her hands, scrubbing near the coffee table while Tiffany stepped around her in beige high heels without even bothering to move aside. Michael sat on the couch nearby scrolling through his phone. His mother was on her knees 2 feet away from him. He never looked up. Not once. Tiffany, I said sharply. She turned, surprised for half a second before smiling again. Oh, Robert. We're just trying to finish cleaning before guests arrive. Evelyn immediately stood up, almost losing her balance in the process. It's all right, she rushed to say. I told her I didn't mind helping. Helping. The word sounded painful coming out of her mouth. Because this wasn't help anymore. This was obedience. Tiffany walked toward the kitchen, sipping wine casually. Honestly, she sighed, older people just take longer with simple things. Michael gave a small uncomfortable laugh. That laugh hit me harder than the insult itself. I looked directly at my son, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He didn't. Instead, he kept staring at his phone like silence could protect him from responsibility. That night, Evelyn barely ate dinner. She kept defending Tiffany between long stretches of exhaustion. She's under pressure. She wants the apartment perfect. She doesn't mean it personally. But while she spoke, her hands trembled around the fork. And I realized something terrifying. A mother will endure almost any humiliation if she believes it's the price of keeping her child close. That was exactly what Tiffany had learned to exploit. Day by day, Evelyn became quieter, smaller, like she was slowly disappearing inside her own kindness. And Michael watched it happen in silence. But this time, I had already started recording everything. That night, after Evelyn went upstairs, I stayed alone in the kitchen long after midnight. Only the small light above the stove remained on. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I kept replaying everything I had seen inside that apartment. Evelyn on her knees. Michael staring at his phone. Tiffany speaking to my wife with the same tone people use on hotel staff they don't respect enough to think. And somehow, the worst part was how normal it had started to feel for them. I opened the drawer beside the sink and stared at the small recording device resting in my palm. For a long moment, I hated myself for even considering it. Then I remembered Evelyn apologizing for not cleaning correctly. That was enough. The next morning, before she left for the apartment again, I stopped her near the front door. Carry this for me, I said quietly. She looked down at the recorder in confusion. Robert, I just want peace of mind. Evelyn hesitated. Her fingers trembled slightly before slipping the device into her coat pocket. She didn't argue. Maybe part of her already knew why I was doing it. The first recordings were almost unbearable to listen to, not because of screaming. There wasn't any. That was what made them worse. Tiffany's cruelty lived inside tiny sentences delivered with perfect calm. Mom, normal people know how to fold towels evenly. You wiped the counter twice, and it still looks dirty. Honestly, I don't understand why simple instructions are so difficult for your generation. Sometimes Michael could be heard nearby, not defending Evelyn, not stopping Tiffany, just existing in the background while his wife slowly stripped his mother's dignity apart piece by piece. One recording captured the sound of dishes clinking softly while Tiffany laughed under her breath. If we ever have kids, she said casually, I hope they don't inherit this level of helplessness. A long silence followed. Then Michael laughed quietly too. I turned the recorder off after that. For several minutes, I simply sat there in the dark kitchen gripping the edge of the table so hard my wrist hurt. How much humiliation does it take before a father finally breaks? The recordings continued for days. Tiny cuts. Tiny insults. Never dramatic enough for outsiders to call abuse. But together, they formed something ugly. Systematic. Cold. One evening, Evelyn came home carrying grocery bags Tiffany had apparently asked her to buy on the way over. She forgot to order dinner, Evelyn explained softly, avoiding my eyes. So I picked something up for them. I watched her unpack food she hadn't even bought for herself. And suddenly, I realized Tiffany no longer saw Evelyn as family at all. Only usefulness. That same night, while I sat organizing the recordings and labeling folders inside my office, my phone buzzed across the desk. Michael. I almost ignored it. But then I answered. And within less than 2 minutes, my son asked me about the inheritance paperwork. I leaned back slowly in my chair after answering the call, expecting at least one question about Evelyn. Maybe guilt. Maybe hesitation. Something human. Instead, Michael got straight to the point. Dad, have you had time to look over the inheritance documents yet? No pause. No, how's Mom? No mention of the wedding. Nothing. I stared at the family photo sitting beside my desk while his voice continued through the phone. It was an old picture from years ago. Evelyn smiling beside me at a lake house in Vermont. Michael standing between us, maybe 12 years old, grinning with missing front teeth and both arms wrapped around his mother. Back then, he used to cry if Evelyn left the room too long. Now he couldn't even ask if she was all right. I'm reviewing some things, I answered carefully. Michael exhaled, almost impatiently. Well, Tiffany and I are trying to plan ahead financially. The sooner everything gets organized, the easier it'll be later. Organized. That word again. Like my life had already become paperwork waiting to be processed. I stayed quiet long enough that he finally spoke again. Dad, you seem very concerned about money lately, I said. A short laugh came through the speaker. It's not like that. But it was exactly like that. I could hear Tiffany faintly in the background asking something about timelines and signatures. Then Michael lowered his voice. I just think it makes sense for me to start handling things now instead of waiting until there's an emergency. Emergency. I looked again at the framed wedding photo leaning against the shelf nearby. Tiffany in white. Michael smiling proudly beside her. Evelyn standing near the edge of the frame, still wearing the replacement dress after being dragged through mud hours earlier. And suddenly, the entire image felt fake. My son no longer looked like family to me. He looked like someone rehearsing ownership. You know, Michael continued casually, most parents transfer assets earlier these days anyway. Most parents. The entitlement in his voice hit harder than anger ever could. Because Michael wasn't asking for help anymore. He was speaking as if everything already belonged to him. As if my role now was simply to sign documents and step aside quietly. A cold weight settled into my chest. My son no longer saw me as his father. Just a signature. Dad, are you listening? Yes, I answered softly. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he finally asked the question that destroyed whatever hope I still had left. So, are we still moving forward with the apartment transfer? Not once during that entire conversation did he ask whether his mother was recovering emotionally. Not once did he apologize for the wedding. The only thing that mattered to him was whether the money was still coming. I ended the call a few minutes later without giving him an answer. Then I sat there alone in the office, while the silence around me grew heavier by the second. Across the room, dozens of old family photographs covered the shelves. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, school graduations. Every frame held proof that I had spent my entire life building something for my family. And somehow, I had raised a son who measured love in assets. If you're still listening right now, then maybe you understand how it feels when the deepest wound doesn't come from strangers, but from your own blood. Tell me honestly, should parents forgive everything simply because it's family? Or is there a point where love without boundaries destroys people? And what do you think? Does Michael still deserve a second chance after everything he's done? Subscribe now, because what happened next turned this quiet family betrayal into a public collapse nobody in that room was prepared for. The morning after Michael's call, I met Daniel Mercer again. This time, neither of us wasted words. The atmosphere inside his office felt heavier than before. Thick folders covered the conference table. Property documents, trust agreements, tax records. Every piece of my life reduced to paper and signatures. Daniel adjusted his glasses and slid one folder toward me. Across the tab, bold black letters read, "Trust Transfer." "You understand what this means," he said carefully. "Once the assets move into the foundation, Michael loses direct access permanently." I opened the folder slowly. For years, I had imagined leaving those properties to my son. The lake house, the investment accounts, the Boston apartment. Every long work night, every sacrifice. I built all of it believing one day my family would protect each other with it. Now I was protecting my family from it. "I understand," I answered. Daniel studied me for a moment before reaching for the legal stamp beside him. The sound echoed sharply across the room. One document after another. Approved. Transferred. Locked. Cold relief settled inside me with every signature. Not happiness. Not revenge. Just certainty. When the final page was complete, Daniel leaned back in silence. "So where does everything go now?" I looked down at the paperwork. "A charitable trust," I said. "For abandoned elderly people." Daniel blinked once, surprised. Then slowly nodded. "That's fitting." Maybe it was. Because somewhere along the way, I had realized something painful. The people most forgotten in this world are often the ones who sacrifice the most for others. A few days later, Tiffany called Evelyn personally. Her tone was suddenly warm again. Excited. Manipulative. "We're having a housewarming party this Saturday," she said brightly. "You and Robert have to come. Everyone important will be there. Everyone important." I almost laughed when Evelyn repeated the invitation to me. Tiffany still believed the apartment belonged to her. She still thought the future had already been secured. That was the dangerous thing about entitled people. They mistake silence for surrender. The entire week leading up to the party, I prepared quietly. No threats. No arguments. No emotional confrontations. I had already learned that some lessons only work when delivered publicly. Pain changes shape when witnesses are involved. The night before the party, I stood inside my closet staring at two suits before finally choosing the black one Evelyn always liked. "You look serious," she said softly when she saw me. "I am serious." She hesitated near the doorway. "Robert, what exactly are you planning?" I walked toward her slowly and adjusted the sleeve of my jacket. "Something overdue." That was all I said. Because I wasn't preparing for revenge anymore. I was preparing for revelation. Meanwhile, across the city, Tiffany was likely arranging flowers, ordering champagne, and proudly showing guests the apartment she believed represented her victory. She had no idea every wall around her was already beginning to collapse. And the cruelest part? She was about to invite an audience to watch it happen. By the end of that week, every document was ready. Every signature. Every clause. Every protection I once built for Michael had quietly been redirected somewhere he would never touch again. Daniel Mercer placed the final folder in front of me inside the conference room. Thick cream-colored paper. Legal tabs. Official seals. Across the front, one title stood out in dark lettering: Trust Transfer. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the office windows while downtown traffic moved far below, like another world entirely. Daniel finally broke the silence. "Once this is filed," he said carefully, "there's no reversing it without your direct authorization." I opened the folder slowly. Page after page carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Properties. Investment accounts. Insurance distributions. Assets I had spent 40 years building so my family would never struggle the way Evelyn and I once did. Now I was moving them out of my son's reach with the same hand that once taught him how to write his own name. "Do it," I said. Daniel nodded once. The legal stamp came down hard against the paper. Thud. One document approved. Thud. Another transfer completed. Each sound landed like the closing of a door. Not emotional. Final. By the time the last page was signed, the majority of my estate no longer pointed toward Michael at all. Instead, it now belonged to a charitable foundation dedicated to elderly people abandoned by their own families. Daniel removed his glasses slowly. "You know," he murmured, "most people would leave everything to their children anyway." I looked at the reflection of my own face in the dark office window. Most children don't stand there while their mother cries in the mud. The room went silent after that. A few days later, Tiffany called Evelyn personally. Her voice sounded bright again. Sweet. Almost affectionate. "We're finally hosting the housewarming party Saturday night," she said excitedly. "You and Robert absolutely have to come. Michael wants the whole family there." The whole family. I nearly smiled hearing that. Tiffany still believed the apartment belonged to her. She still believed the future had already been secured. That was the thing about people who confuse generosity with weakness. They never notice the moment the rules change. The night before the party, I stood in my bedroom staring at two suits hanging beside the closet door. Gray or black? I chose black. Evelyn watched quietly from the edge of the bed. "You haven't looked this serious in years," she whispered. I buttoned the jacket slowly. "Because this isn't a normal dinner." She hesitated before speaking again. "Robert, are you going to confront them?" I turned toward her. "No," I answered calmly. "I'm going to let the truth confront them." A faint shiver passed across her face, though I couldn't tell whether it came from fear or relief. Maybe both. Later that night, While the city slept, I sat alone in my office one final time reviewing every recording, every signed document, every legal authorization Daniel prepared for the next evening. No mistakes, no emotion, only timing. Because some lessons are too deep for private conversations. Some humiliations only make sense when exposed under bright lights in front of witnesses. And across town, Tiffany was probably decorating the apartment, chilling champagne, and proudly preparing guests to admire a future she believed she already owned. She had no idea. None of it belonged to her anymore. By the time Evelyn and I arrived at the apartment, the party was already in full swing. Warm golden lights reflected across the marble floors. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of champagne and catered food. Everywhere I looked, people were laughing too loudly, complimenting the apartment as if it were some kind of palace. Tiffany stood near the center of the room holding a crystal champagne glass between perfectly manicured fingers. She looked radiant, victorious. Every few minutes, she guided another group of guests toward the balcony view while casually dropping comments designed to impress. We wanted something elegant but modern. Michael and I are already discussing expanding our investments next year. Oh, Robert helped in the beginning, of course, but eventually this place will fully belong to us anyway. Us. The word lingered in the air each time she said it. Michael stayed close beside her all evening, smiling politely at business associates and wealthy friends while pretending nothing in our family had changed. But I noticed something beneath his confidence tonight. Nervousness. Tiny signs. The way he kept checking his phone. The way his smile faded whenever our eyes met. Evelyn stood quietly beside me near the edge of the room, wearing a dark blue dress instead of white this time. She looked uncomfortable surrounded by people who treated warmth like performance. "You all right?" I asked softly. She nodded, though her fingers tightened around her purse. "I just want tonight to end peacefully." I didn't answer, because peace had already ended long ago. Across the room, Tiffany laughed loudly at something one of her guests said. Honestly, she joked while sipping champagne, married life feels very different when you finally move into the right tax bracket. Several people laughed with her. Then the doorbell rang. Once. Sharp. Clear. At first, nobody paid attention. One of Tiffany's friends casually opened the door, expecting more guests. Instead, 3 people stepped inside wearing dark professional suits. Daniel Mercer entered first carrying a leather briefcase. Behind him came 2 legal representatives holding folders. The energy in the apartment shifted instantly. Conversation slowed. Music still played softly for a few seconds longer before someone near the speaker lowered the volume completely. Tiffany blinked in confusion. "Robert?" she asked slowly. "What is this?" I set my glass down carefully. "My attorneys," I answered. Michael's face drained of color almost immediately. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Daniel walked toward the center of the living room with calm precision. "I apologize for interrupting the evening," he said professionally. "But several legal matters require immediate clarification regarding ownership and asset transfer connected to this property." The room fell completely silent. You could hear ice shifting inside untouched glasses. Tiffany forced a small laugh. "I think there's some misunderstanding." "There isn't," Daniel replied. One of the representatives opened a folder and placed several documents across the marble counter. Official seals. Signatures. Transfer authorizations. Tiffany stared down at them, her expression tightening with every page. Michael stepped forward quickly. Dad, what is this? I looked directly at him. The consequences of underestimating your parents. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Tiffany's voice rose slightly. You can't seriously do this now. In front of everyone. I glanced around the apartment. The same apartment she had proudly displayed all night like proof of victory. Actually, I said quietly, this is exactly where it needs to happen. Michael swallowed hard. One guest slowly placed his champagne glass onto the table and stepped back. Another couple exchanged nervous looks near the balcony. Because people were beginning to understand. This wasn't family tension anymore. This was collapse. And standing in the middle of that perfect apartment, watching Tiffany's confident smile slowly disappear for the first time, I found myself wondering something cold. If the money vanished tonight, would they still love each other tomorrow? Then Daniel opened his briefcase again. And the video started playing. Daniel connected the laptop to the apartment's television without saying another word. For a second, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered. The garden appeared. Rainwater still covering the grass. Wedding lights glowing through the darkness. A few guests shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the scene immediately. Tiffany's face lost color. Robert, she whispered. Don't do this. I didn't answer. The footage continued. Evelyn stood beside me in her white dress, smiling softly at Michael just seconds before everything changed. Then came the sound. Fabric tearing. Sharp. Violent. Several guests physically flinched hearing it through the speakers. Evelyn stumbled backward on screen before crashing into the mud. The champagne glasses around the apartment stopped moving entirely. And then Tiffany laughed. Loudly. Cruelly. Oh my God, her recorded voice echoed through the room. Seriously? On my wedding day? The sound hit differently now. Not playful. Not harmless. Ugly. Someone near the balcony lowered their eyes immediately. Another guest slowly stepped farther away from Tiffany like distance itself suddenly mattered. On screen, Evelyn struggled to push herself up from the mud while flashes from cameras kept exploding around her face. And in the background, Michael stood there watching. Doing nothing. Not helping. Not moving. Not even reaching out his hand. The silence inside the apartment became unbearable. You could hear people breathing. That heavy. That tense. Tiffany shook her head rapidly. It's out of context, she said quickly. This is ridiculous. But nobody responded. Because there was no context that could save her anymore. The video ended with Evelyn standing in soaked fabric while Tiffany rolled her eyes impatiently. The screen went black. For several long seconds, no one in the apartment moved at all. Then Tiffany's hand began trembling around her champagne glass. A small crackling sound echoed before the glass slipped from her fingers completely and shattered across the marble floor. Nobody rushed to help her. Not one person. That was the moment she realized the room had turned against her. Michael looked pale enough to collapse. But even now, he still couldn't bring himself to look directly at his mother. I stepped forward slowly. Every eye in the apartment followed me. I spent my entire life believing family meant loyalty, I said calmly. I believed respect was something children naturally carried for the people who raised them. No one interrupted. I watched my wife get humiliated publicly while my own son stood there in silence. Michael swallowed hard. Dad, I raised my hand once. He stopped speaking immediately. You didn't fail your mother in one moment, I continued quietly. You failed her repeatedly. Every time you looked away. Every time you stayed silent, because it was easier than protecting her. Michael's face tightened with shame. Tiffany stepped forward desperately. This is insane. You're humiliating us over one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding? I repeated. I turned toward the television screen, still frozen on Evelyn's face covered in mud. That woman spent decades loving both of you. The room remained completely still. Then I delivered the final truth. Every financial agreement connected to this apartment has been terminated effective immediately. Several guests gasped softly. Michael looked stunned. Tiffany stared at me in disbelief. You can't do that. I already did. Daniel opened another folder and handed copies of the legal transfer documents to the representatives nearby. I spoke without raising my voice. The apartment funding, investment transfers, inheritance access, and all future property allocations have been permanently redirected into a charitable foundation supporting elderly people abandoned by their families. The words landed like explosives. Tiffany's lips parted, but nothing came out. Michael finally stepped toward me. You gave everything away? I looked directly into his eyes for the first time that night. No, I answered. I gave it to people who still understand gratitude. A stunned silence spread through the apartment. The expensive lights, the champagne, the designer furniture. Suddenly none of it looked impressive anymore. It looked hollow, like a stage set collapsing after the audience finally sees the truth behind it. And standing there in the middle of her perfect party, abandoned by the same guests who had admired her only minutes earlier, Tiffany looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not powerful, not elegant, just exposed. But even then, I knew the greatest price had not arrived yet. The collapse didn't happen all at once. That would have been too easy. Instead, it came slowly, quietly. Like water leaking through cracks no one notices until the walls begin falling apart. 3 days after the party, Michael called me 12 times. I never answered. By the second week, his messages changed tone completely. Dad, please call me. We can fix this. Tiffany is really upset. Not one message mentioned Evelyn. Not one apology sounded genuine. Everything still revolved around damage control. Then reality finally arrived. Michael's firm had already heard about the incident from several guests who attended the party. One of Tiffany's friends had uploaded part of the confrontation online before deleting it hours later, but by then it had already spread through private circles. People talk, especially wealthy people protecting reputations. Michael stopped appearing at networking events after that. 2 important clients quietly withdrew from a business deal connected to his department. Nobody officially blamed him. They didn't need to. Shame works faster than accusations. One evening, I drove past the apartment building after returning from dinner with Evelyn. The lights inside their unit were off except for the kitchen. Michael sat alone at the counter in complete darkness, illuminated only by the refrigerator light while unpaid envelopes and printed bills covered the marble surface around him. For the first time in his life, nobody was rescuing him. Meanwhile, Tiffany's world collapsed even faster. The same family that once celebrated her suddenly became difficult to reach. Calls unanswered. Messages ignored. Her father, Richard, reportedly told friends the situation had become too messy for public involvement. Too messy. Interesting choice of words from a man who once discussed my death over champagne. A week later, Evelyn received a voicemail from Tiffany at nearly midnight. She was crying. Not elegant crying. Desperate crying. I don't know what to do anymore, Tiffany whispered through broken breaths. Michael barely talks to me. Everyone disappeared. Evelyn listened to the message twice without speaking, then quietly deleted it. Because even compassion becomes exhausted eventually. The bills kept arriving after that. Mortgage notices, credit balances, investment reversals. The lifestyle Tiffany built her identity around had never truly belonged to her in the first place. And now the illusion was bleeding out in slow motion. One rainy evening, I found myself thinking about something strange while sitting beside Evelyn in the quiet living room. When money disappears, what remains? Love? Loyalty? Character? Or just the truth people were hiding all along? Across the city, Michael and Tiffany finally sat alone inside the ruins of the life they once displayed so proudly to everyone else. No applause. No admiration. No audience left to impress. Only silence. And consequences. A month later, Evelyn asked me a question I never expected to hear. What would happen, she said quietly one morning, if we simply left all of this behind? I looked up from my coffee. She stood near the kitchen window wearing a soft gray sweater, sunlight touching her face in a way I hadn't seen for a very long time. Lighter. Less afraid. Not healed yet. But beginning. 2 weeks later, we sold the house. The same house where we raised Michael. Where Evelyn painted nursery walls by hand before he was born. Where Christmas lights once hung across the front porch every winter. Packing it all away hurt more than I expected. But strangely, staying would have hurt more. So we left. No dramatic goodbye. No final confrontation. Just quiet movement forward. We spent the next several months traveling along the coast, moving slowly from town to town without plans or schedules. Small hotels. Ocean air. Long walks near the water. For the first time in years, Evelyn began sleeping peacefully again. One evening in California, we sat together near the beach while the sun melted into the horizon in deep orange light. Waves rolled softly onto the shore while cold wind moved through Evelyn's hair. She smiled suddenly at something small. A child chasing seagulls near the water. The sound caught me off guard, because I realized I hadn't heard her laugh naturally in a very long time. Without pressure. Without exhaustion hiding underneath it. I reached for her hand quietly. She held mine back immediately. No words. None were needed. After everything that happened, I finally understood something I should have learned years earlier. The greatest form of peace is not revenge. It's distance. Distance from people who confuse kindness with weakness. Distance from those who only love you when you are useful to them. Evelyn leaned her head gently against my shoulder while the sky darkened over the ocean. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. I knew exactly what she meant. The inheritance. The confrontation. Michael. I watched the waves for several seconds before answering. "No," I said honestly. "I regret waiting so long to protect us." Evelyn's eyes filled slightly with tears, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. They looked closer to relief. And sitting there beside the ocean with her hand still wrapped around mine, I realized something simple and painful at the same time. Sometimes the greatest happiness in life comes from finally leaving the place that kept hurting you. Months have passed since that night. Sometimes people still ask whether I hate my son now. The truth is more complicated than that. Hate is loud. What I feel is quieter. Heavier. Like grief mixed with acceptance. For a long time, I believed good parents endured everything in silence. The disrespect. The manipulation. The slow humiliation that hides inside ordinary moments. We call it patience. We call it sacrifice. But eventually I learned something painful. Silence is not always love. Sometimes it is exhaustion. Sometimes it is fear of losing the people you spent your whole life protecting. I think that's what happened to Evelyn. And maybe for years it happened to me too. Because parents become so used to giving, they forget they are human beings before they are caretakers. They forgive too quickly, excuse too much, stay too long. Not because they are weak, because they love deeply. But every heart has a limit, even a parent's. The night I stood inside that apartment and watched Michael avoid his mother's eyes while she cried in front of strangers, something inside me finally broke beyond repair. Not my love for him, my illusion of him. And once illusions die, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Family should never require humiliation as proof of loyalty. Love should not demand self-destruction. And respect should never disappear simply because someone believes you will always stay no matter how badly they treat you. That is the mistake Michael and Tiffany made. They believed forgiveness was guaranteed, that parents would endure forever. But people are not permanent just because they love you. Parents do not need to be worshipped, but they should never be treated like they will always be there no matter what. Before this story ends, I want to ask you something honestly. If your parents are still alive today, call them. Not tomorrow. Not when things calm down. Today. Because people often realize the value of love only after they've exhausted the person giving it. And maybe that's the hardest part of this story. Not the money. Not the humiliation. But how easily a family can slowly stop seeing each other as human. So tell me, was Robert right to walk away and take everything back? Or did he become too cold in the end? And if you were standing in his place, watching your own child betray the person who sacrificed everything for them, would you still forgive them? Or would you finally choose yourself for once? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories like this stay in your mind long after the video ends, subscribe now for more emotional family dramas, shocking betrayals, and unforgettable revenge stories that force us to question what family really means.